with a couple thanks. You just noted that it says recording in progress. So as you frame your questions, remember, this is for posterity. Let me thank both May-Jean Daniels and Karen Stuck for the promotion of these events. They do the advertising for us. We couldn't do it without them. Thanks also to Mary Bloodworth, who does all the tech stuff behind the scenes for us. And of course, Judy Berman for everything she does for the village. We do ask you to turn your mics off and keep them off during the presentation. If you think you've got a question and it's burning and you think you're going to forget it by the end of the hour,
oh, you became muted.
I became muted. Mary and I are going to be watching the chat, and we'll try to make sure that we get all your questions answered. So if you really have a question that you think you're not going to remember to the end of the program, please put it in the chat and we'll make sure we get back to you then. Okay, the other thing I want to do is tell you the rest of the fall lineup. October 10, it's a Monday. We're going to have Robert Krughoff. You may know him. He was the founder of Washington Consumer Checkbook. And he's going to talk about what he sees as the changing consumer experience over the past several decades. Then on November 14, we're again a Monday. We're going to have Mai Phan, and she's quite extraordinary. She's a doctor. She's a Vietnamese refugee. She is a cook who cooked in the British Bake Off, and she's published a book on Vietnamese food and family. And she's going to talk about food and the refugee experience. And then in December 5, we're going to have a really special program for the holiday season. It's a panel of poets, and it's led by Janet Reedy. And we're going to have probably 4 poets talk about their inspiration, read one of their poems, read a poem that inspires them. And that will be the finale for our autumn season. So join us. They're all on Monday nights. They're all on 7 to 8. Tonight we have with us Leslie Rowland, a historian, a PhD from the University of Rochester. She teaches at the University of Maryland, and she is probably the person who has read more of the Freedmen's Bureau records at the National Archives than anybody else in the United States and around the world. She's participated in a major documentary project on Southern society and freedmen. 6 volumes have been published. The 7th is underway, and she has just gotten a very large grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to do what are supposedly the 8th and 9th final volumes of this enormous documentary history of emancipation. So with that, let me turn it over to Leslie to talk about Southern society after the war.
Okay, thank you, Trudy. Before I start, I have to say that looking at your backgrounds, I'm in my office at the University of Maryland campus, and it is so much darker here than it is in your Capitol Hill residences. How can that be? But you look like you still have some sunshine out there, and I've got night. Anyway, that's irrelevant, but I thought I would begin by saying that was one of my observations. Okay, I'm going to share my screen so that I can use PowerPoints as we go along. Let's see, where do I start my... Oops. Okay, there we go. All right, as Trudy said, I'm the director of a project called the Freedmen in Southern Society Project, whose main publication is a multi-volume documentary history of emancipation between the beginning of the Civil War and the beginning of radical Reconstruction, so 1861 to 1867. In addition to the 6 volumes of Freedom that Trudy mentioned, we've also published 4 additional volumes that are for general audiences and use in the classroom, and they're all in paperback. At the very end of the presentation, I'll have a slide that lists some of those if you might be interested. We also have a website that has a number of the documents that I'll be using tonight, but let me jump right in. Now, every historian will tell you that his or her subject matter is the most important, but mine really is, because I think it's fair to say that there are very few historical events that match the drama of emancipation. In the United States, emancipation, of course, accompanied the military defeat of what had become the world's most powerful slave owning class. It freed a larger number of slaves than did the end of slavery in all other New World societies combined. If you combine the other emancipations, the emancipation in the US, the number of slaves freed outnumbered them. Emancipation, as you all know, was born in the US. It's born of a bloody civil war, and it accomplished a profound social revolution. It destroyed a way of life based on the ownership of human beings, liquidated without compensation private property that was valued at billions of dollars. It forcibly substituted the relations of free labor for those of slavery, and it placed citizenship upon new ground defined in the federal Constitution. But those are the high level kinds of accomplishments. I'm going to be operating more on the ground level, because emancipation also generated unprecedented documentation of the experiences, beliefs, and aspirations of slaves and ex-slaves, who are people that are generally assumed to have left.
See who's on the meeting.
Who are assumed to have left
All these
records. I'm sorry, does someone have a microphone on? I'm getting some interference. So it left unprecedented documentation of the experiences, beliefs, and aspirations of people who are generally assumed to have left few written records. The project I direct has scoured the National Archives to uncover those records, and we're using them to document the transition from slavery to freedom. And my goal tonight is to share a few of those documents with you, along the way, casting light on selected aspects of the Civil War and Reconstruction in the US South. Now, I'll begin with an idealized, triumphalist lithograph about emancipation that was published at the end of the Civil War. If you look on the left, let me get my pointer here. Okay, on the left side here, you see images that represent slavery. This is the before pictures. This top one is the hunting fugitive slaves with dogs. In the middle, the sale of slaves at auction, including the separation of families by sale, brutal punishments, whipping. I'm not quite sure what they're doing to this guy, but this is to represent the whippings and other punishments of slavery. On the right-hand side, we have the after pictures. First, we have the Union Army led by Lady Liberty bringing freedom by the sword. So the fact that slavery is ended by the sword at the hands of the Union Army. In the middle, we have Black children now free, attending school with a US flag on top of the school. The bottom image is of ex-slaves receiving wages for their labor instead of the unpaid labor of slavery. And at the very center, we have an image of a secure family life that is free from the impositions made by slave owners, by sale, by sexual assault, by intervening between parents and children. Now a secure family life, in this case, 3 generations of a family are depicted. See the older woman in the middle here. And from the decor and the dress, we also are meant to see that this is a free home. These are symbols of domesticity and of a decor far superior to that of the slave column. So here's the idealized image of emancipation. This image, of course, conveys none of the travails of emancipation, none of the difficulties, the violence, and so on. But it's not a bad place to start. Now, to start our use of some of the documents, I'm going to begin with a document by a man named John Boston, who was a slave in Maryland. I deliberately picked some documents from this region, thinking they might be of particular interest. This is a highly unusual document because this is a document by a fugitive slave writing back to tell his wife that he has successfully escaped slavery. This is early in the war, January of 1862. John Boston had fled slavery as Union troops were moving through Maryland to DC and Northern Virginia. And he was harbored by troops in a New York regiment. And so he's now just across the Potomac River in Virginia and writes to tell his wife that he has escaped. I put a transcription on the right. You can see this is just the first page of the letter, his own writing on the left. So he says, "My dear wife, it's with great joy I take this time to let you know where I am. I am now in safety in the 14th Regiment of Brooklyn. This day I can address you, thank God, as a free man. I had a little trouble in getting away, but as the Lord led the children of Israel to the land of Canaan, so he led me to the land where freedom will reign in spite of earth and hell. Dear, you must make yourself content. I am free from all the slaver's lash. And as you have chose the wise plan of serving the Lord, I hope you will pray much." We skip a little. "I'm with a very nice man and have all that heart can wish, but my dear, I can't express my great desire that I have to see you. I trust the time will come when we shall meet again. And if we don't meet on earth, we will meet in heaven where Jesus reigns." Now, let me point, we'll look at the second page in a moment, but let me point to a few features of this letter. If you look at it, you'll see there is not a single mark of punctuation, not one. The spelling is entirely irregular. But as you listen to it, you realize this is a man who has a command of the language. He doesn't have doesn't have educated literacy, but this is a very literary letter. You can hear in it the cadences of the King James Bible. You can also see that he's a product of a largely oral culture that values storytelling and wordplay. So it's a product of the largely oral culture of that was slave culture and of the language of the King James Bible. And this is typical of many of the documents we encountered. I won't go read the whole of the second page, except to note that at the end, he says, he signs off as your affectionate husband. And then this postscript, which is very touching, he says, "Kiss Daniel for me and give my love to father and mother." Now, this document we found in the National Archives, which holds the records created and collected by agencies of the federal government. How in the world did this entirely private letter from a fugitive slave to his wife end up in the National Archives? Every time we found a letter like this, it had a story, a trajectory that had brought it into the files of the National Archives. In this case, the letter was intercepted. We don't know whether it was before Elizabeth Boston received it or after, but it was intercepted by some white person who was outraged to know that this fugitive slave had been harbored by a Union regiment, taken into Virginia. And so he forwarded it to his representative in the Maryland House of Delegates. The Maryland legislature had extensive debates and discussion about the number of Maryland slaves who were finding refuge in Union regiments. And they appointed a delegation to go to the War Department in Washington to present evidence of these outrages and to demand that Union troops stop harboring slaves. Bear in mind that at this moment, the announced purpose of the war was only to restore the Union. There had been promises issued not to interfere with slavery. And so the Maryland legislatures used this letter as well as other documents to prove that slaves were escaping to Union lines, and the Union and the Army should be armed. Soldiers and officers who were harboring slaves should be disciplined. John Boston was one of the earliest. Oh, so that's how it ended up in the records of the U.S. Secretary of War for that reason. John Boston was just one of hundreds, then eventually thousands, and eventually tens of thousands of slaves who, as opportunities arose, and often at great personal risk, made their way into Union military lines or to Union blockading ships. These images represent those early fugitives. They were at first tentative. They didn't know how they'd be received, usually singly or in small groups. But as the Union Army came to be known as to be more welcoming to fugitive slaves, entire families began to escape. And then after the issue of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, when the ending of slavery became an aim of the war, in addition to restoration of the Union, beginning then, even larger groups of slaves escaped, and as in this image, actually accompanied by and assisted by Union soldiers. Among the Union soldiers who were most active in liberating slaves were the Black soldiers, who, after the Emancipation Proclamation, began to be recruited into the Union Army. As you can well imagine, Black soldiers took a special pleasure in playing the role of liberator, most of them themselves having been slaves. Now, as fugitive slaves entered Union military lines and began laboring for the Union Army in constructing fortifications, loading and unloading supplies, driving teams, working in military hospitals, washing clothes, serving as guides, spies, all kinds of employments. Their lives became more and more entwined with agencies of the federal government, especially the Union Army. Then after the end of the war, federal authorities moved across into the whole of the South as the Union occupying army and as agents of the newly created Freedmen's Bureau, which was created by a law of March 1865 to oversee the transition from slavery to freedom. And their interaction with freed people and former slave owners in the South also created enormous volumes of federal records that document the transition from slavery to freedom. Both during the war and after, labor was a central concern of these federal agencies. That is, encouraging or even forcing ex-slaves to enter into labor contracts, and urging them. Look at this flyer on the right. It ends by, it's saying everybody needs to enter into labor contracts. Do not delay with the vain hope that the government will give you land and other property. On the left is a labor contract signed by a freed woman who contracted to work for 3 months as a nurse, which was the name. That doesn't mean a medical nurse. It means like a nanny, a childcare person. And the contract on the left, the pay is only for board, clothes, and medical attendance, no wages at all. So encouraging freed people to enter into labor contracts was a major activity. But there's also, and there are files and files of contracts of labor and documentation of labor disputes. But there's also rich documentation about education, about justice, about the humanitarian crisis that followed emancipation, smallpox epidemics, about violence of all kinds, contests over church property, issues of trying to reunite families who've been separated in slavery, on and on. In short, both the war and Reconstruction generated huge volumes of routine documents of all kinds and military documents of all kinds, but also scattered among those records, hundreds, maybe even thousands of documents that include direct testimony from ex-slaves, those people that are thought to have seldom left many written records. Now, as you might expect, the majority of the documents by slaves and ex-slaves in the government files represented appeals to government officials, usually military officials or Freedmen's Bureau agents, for assistance in response to abuse or injustice at the hands of former slave owners. Here's a good example. This is a letter from a freedman named Joe Bright in North Carolina, who had rented 40 acres of land for the 1866 year for independent farming. That is, instead of the gang labor under overseers that planters were trying to reimpose, Joe Bright was one of the minority who managed to rent land to work independently with the labor of his family. But he was not allowed to do that peacefully. And he writes to tell a Freedmen's Bureau agent what has happened. He says that he has 6 teenage children whom he expected to have as the workers on his farm. And he says, I need all to do this labor. I'm also a mason and a plasterer, and I'm perfectly capable to support my family. And I would do right well if the people in Sampson County would not interfere with my family matters. But they broke me down 3 times by taking away my help on the farm, my children. Now, what had happened is that the children had been seized and bound as apprentices to the former owner of Joe Bright's wife and to 2 other white men by the county court of Sampson. So in order to thwart this, in the independence of this freedman, white men in the neighboring county had seized, including the former owner of Bright's wife, had seized the children and had them bound, the girls to age 18, the boys to age 21, as apprentices, which would mean they would work without pay until they reached their majority. He tells the Freedmen's Bureau agent, this starts here, he's talking about his need for these children. Says, all these children is growing and of much use for me. The youngest of the crowd is 12 years old, the other between 12 and 18. He says, I know the law does not allow children to be bound out if their parents are able or capable of supporting them. But still, these men, and I quote now, they thought they had a better right of my children than I had, and took them from the cornfield and plow and carried them off to their house. Now, this is a case where the Freedmen's Bureau, one thing to notice here is that freed people now had a venue to which they could take complaints that is separate from their former owners, may have some power over their former owners. And in this case, indeed, the Freedmen's Bureau agent in Wilmington, North Carolina, to whom Bright had written, ordered the children returned to him immediately. His order said, as it appears from these papers, that he never gave consent to their being bound. So the presence of the Freedmen's Bureau intervened between the efforts of former slave owners to break up this independent farmer by seizing his children. When Black orphans and those who'd been separated from their parents during slavery or the war, also the children of single mothers, these were the ones who were the most vulnerable to being involuntarily apprenticed. When they, and often to their former owners. To the freed people, this widespread apprenticing of their children seemed like returning them to slavery. And there are huge waves of protest against the widespread apprenticeship. Now, in many cases where children were bound out, kin of all kinds tried to intervene to prevent them from being, in effect, re-enslaved. And this is one short example by a freedwoman named Sally Harris, who wrote to the local Freedmen's Bureau agent, this one's in Virginia, saying that her cousin Wilson, she wants him bound to her instead of to his former owner. She says, I have a house for him and will take care of him. My brothers Albert and Hal will do the same. So she's saying I have extended kin who will also help out. I want him removed from Mr. J's because he's not treated well. And as he is my cousin, I think it my duty to see to him. So you can see evidence here also of the workings of extended kinship in ex-slave communities. Even before the Freedmen's Bureau existed, ex-slaves, especially Black soldiers, believed themselves entitled to make claims on government authorities. This is an example of a Black soldier stationed in Florida who wrote to a general in Louisiana asking the general, or really almost instructing him, to go to the Louisiana plantation where his extended family was still held in slavery and liberate them. I didn't do the transcription of this one, but here's how it begins up here. I beg you the grantor function of a small favor. And he asks him this, he's talking to a general. He says, will you please cross the Mississippi River at Bayou Sarah, Louisiana with your command and go to, he names the plantation, and take away my father and mother and my brother's wife with all their children. I wishes the children all in school. It's better for them than to be serving a mistress. And then he says, it won't be me. He says, sir, it isn't more than 3 or 4 hours trouble. And before he closes, he writes a little about the military accomplishments of his regiment. He says, we're doing all the hard fighting here in Florida. They calls our regiment the Blue-Bellied Eagles. What interests me the most about this letter is his sense of entitlement to write to a U.S. general and say, it'll only take 3 or 4 hours, go liberate my family from this plantation. Soldiers were not the only ones who turned to federal officials. Annie Davis, who was an enslaved woman in Maryland, wrote straight to the top. That is, she wrote to Abraham Lincoln in August of 1864. Mr. President, she wrote, it's my desire to be free to go to see my people on the Eastern Shore. My mistress won't let me. You will please let me know if we are free and what I can do. I write to you for advice. Please send me word this week or as soon as possible, and oblige. Now, this letter was forwarded by Lincoln's secretary. It's doubtful that Lincoln read it at all. Forwarded by the secretary to the Bureau of Colored Troops, where a notation on the reverse says merely file, the word file. And we looked in the letters sent volumes of the Bureau of Colored Troops and found no response to the letter. So it appears that her letter was just entirely ignored. Had they answered it, the answer, of course, would have had to be, no, you are not free. Because since Maryland had not seceded, it's untouched by the Emancipation Proclamation, and slavery would not be ended in Maryland until November 1st, 1864, when a new state constitution that included a provision for emancipation went into effect. Now here, let me emphasize that the documents we uncovered by slaves and ex-slaves are not limited to those like Annie Davis or the soldier in in Florida, Joseph Harris. They're not limited to letters like those by people who possess some degree of literacy or had found somebody to write for them. The testimony we found is not limited to the minority who were literate. And here, the Freedmen's Bureau was especially important in creating a venue where the entirely illiterate people could voice their concerns and leave a record. The Freedmen's Bureau served as a kind of third party, standing between the former slaves and the former masters. That is, they weren't agents of the freed people, and they sometimes took actions that the freed people didn't like at all. And they weren't the agents of white Southerners either, because they certainly took actions that former slave owners despise. The Freedmen's Bureau was a representative, I would argue, of Northern free labor ideology and of Northern white middle class sentiments and attitudes and values. It's also important to realize that the sympathies of individual agents varied from person to person. Some worked much more strenuously on behalf of the freed people. Some seemed interested only in clapping them into labor contracts and making sure they weren't eligible for welfare. But whatever the agent's sympathies, the work of the Freedmen's Bureau created records that captured a wide array of the freed people's concerns. And Freedmen's Bureau courts heard disputes of all kinds. And these all created documents by the illiterate masses as well as the literate few. Here are just a few examples. The most numerous form of direct testimony are affidavits like this one, signed with an X. You can see that she was illiterate. She signs the affidavit with an X. That is, the affidavit is written by the Freedmen's Bureau agent, who then swore her to the truth of it, and then she signed the X. So affidavits like this and testimony in Freedmen's Bureau courts. And scattered in the records amid all kinds of bureaucratic trivia. I mean, this affidavit might be next to a document that's a requisition for hay for the agent's horse, for example. But scattered among those the bureaucratic records, often trivial, are hundreds of affidavits and other forms of testimony like this one. This is a case of, in April of 1867, that is 2 years after the end of the Civil War, a Freedmen's Bureau agent recorded this affidavit of Rebecca Parsons, a freed woman whose 4 children were still being held by their old master. And by refusing to release the children from bondage, that former owner had in effect retained not only their labor, but also that of their mother, who would not leave without them. When she first tried to remove them, he beat her brutally. So he responded first with the means of domination drawn from the familiar repertoire of slavery. But when she renewed her efforts to claim them, he also employed means of domination that came from the new conditions of freedom. That is, he formalized his control over the children by having them bound to him under state apprenticeship laws, on the grounds that as a single mother, she was not capable of supporting them. Here's another affidavit that is really a shocking number of affidavits like this one testify to brutal acts of violence against freed people. This is not a document for children. So if you have any children in the background, this is a time to escort them out of the room. This is a really painful document, but I wish I could say it's unusual, but it's not. I mean, it has its own unusual features, but there are hundreds of documents of this kind of brutal violence. It's an affidavit by a woman named Rhoda Ann Childs, who in September of 1866 came to a Freedmen's Bureau agent's office, it was a transcription, and gave this affidavit. She was the wife of a Black veteran, a man who had served in the Union Army. And she says that one night, a group of 8 white men, the number of men is given near the end of the affidavit, appeared at their house. We were called upon one night and they demanded her husband. She said he was not there. He wasn't there. So they seized her. They then seized me and took me some distance from the house, where they bucked me down across a log, stripped my clothes over my head, one of the men standing astride my neck, and they beat me across my posterior, 2 men holding my legs. In this manner, I was beaten until they were tired. They then turned me parallel with the log, laying my neck on a limb which projected from the log, and one man placing his foot upon my neck beat me again on my hip and thigh. Then I was thrown upon the ground on my back. One of the men stood upon my breast, while 2 others took hold of my feet and stretched my limbs as far apart as they could, while the man standing upon my breast applied the strap to my private parts until fatigued into stopping, and I was more dead than alive. So a sadistic beating first with sexual overtones. Then a man supposed to be an ex-Confederate soldier, as he was on crutches, fell upon me and ravished me. So then she was raped. During the whipping, one of the men ran his pistol into me and said he had a hell of a mind to pull the trigger. So she's sodomized with a pistol. And they swore they ought to shoot me, as my husband had been in the goddamn Yankee Army. And they swore they meant to kill every Black son of a bitch they could find that had ever fought against them. They then went back to the house, seized her 2 daughters and beat them. They did not rape the daughters. And then they stole possessions. So documents like this, when you encounter them in the archives, they take your breath away. They're shocking, but they capture, here's a woman entirely illiterate, but she could go to the Freedmen's Bureau agent to report this atrocity that had been committed against her. Now we need something a little lighter after that. So to help us recover from that brutal account, let me shift briefly to another form of evidence that's indirect rather than direct, but nevertheless marvelous evidence of freed people's aspirations and experiences during the transition from slavery to freedom. Here, for example, is a declaration by a Black soldier, a Black non-commissioned officer, after the men had just heard an address by a Freedmen's Bureau superintendent of marriages in June of 1866. And this is quoted by the superintendent of marriages in his report. That's why I say it's indirect evidence. So he's saying, I gave this address, and then Corporal Murray stood up, and here's what he said. He said, I praise God for this day. I've long been praying for it. The marriage covenant is at the foundation of all our rights. In slavery, we could not have legalized marriage. Now we have it. Let us conduct ourselves worthy of such a blessing, and all the people will respect us. God will bless us, and we shall be established as a people. Another example of indirect evidence that I also like, because it's evidence that there's some constants in human relationships, that is, some things that don't change. Here's a short letter in which a white officer in a Black regiment wrote to say that Private Samuel Bolton of this company wishes to lodge a complaint against his mother-in-law, who is the alleged cause of much trouble between himself and his wife. He desires her to move out of his house, and she refuses to do so. I'm not sure what he thought the officer could do about it, but it does make you realize that certain kinds of family disputes have long histories. The federal bureaucracy also captured all sorts of less common but equally valuable documents. One example, I don't have a slide of this, is a threatening notice that was left in the yard of a Black family that had rented land and was farming independently. Second example is these photos of a former slave named Hubbard Pryor from Georgia, who had escaped to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then enlisted in the Union Army. These are his before and after pictures. I can still remember opening the envelope at the National Archives, and these little pictures fell out. Now, so far, I've shown you letters to government officials, affidavits and testimonies sworn before government officials, and documents created by government officials. But there's another kind of rare, much more rare and highly valuable documentation to be found scattered among the official records. And that is some entirely private correspondence that for various reasons fell into the bureaucratic net and were therefore preserved along with official records. That opening letter I read by John Boston, you've already seen one example. So that power of the bureaucracy to capture and preserve entirely private records makes me one of the few people in the world who praise bureaucracies. It's because of bureaucracy that these letters got preserved. But here's another example. This is a letter from an enslaved woman in Missouri named Anne Valentine to her husband, Andrew Valentine, who had escaped slavery and enlisted in the Union Army. And it has a lot to tell us, both about the difficult circumstances of emancipation and also about the hopes and aspirations of the enslaved. Here's the transcription. She begins by saying, "I received your letter, but I have got no one till now to write for me." So she's illiterate and has to have someone write letters for her. One thing that interests me is look how short a time it's been, but she's apologizing. His letter had been dated January 9th and also one on January 1st. It's only January 19th, but she's apologizing for being so slow to write back. But she then tells him, "They are treating me worse and worse every day. Our child cries for you. Send me some money as soon as you can, for me and my child are almost naked." Many slaveholders who were angered by the departure of enslaved men to enlist in the Union Army took it out on the soldiers' families. But then at the end, she says, "Do the best you can and do not fret too much for me, for it won't be long before I will be free, and then all we make will be ours." An acute awareness that their labor had been stolen from them as slaves. And then this touching postscript: "Send our little girl a string of beads in your next letter to remember you by." There's a notation by the white neighbor who had written this letter for her, warning him to not send too many letters or the master's going to get suspicious. And if he sends any money, to send it to this neighbor and he'll give it to the wife. Now, this letter ended up an entirely private letter from a soldier's wife to her husband. It ended up in the government records because the husband took it to his company commander and complained about the treatment his wife was receiving. And this and several other letters like it were passed up the chain of command to the commander of the department. I'm not sure he was able to do anything, but it ended up in the military records. All right, our time is running short, so let me just more quickly. Here is a little example of a private letter from a soldier to his wife, just saying, he says, "We recently had a battle. We fought 5 hours. We whipped the rebels out." And then it gives greetings to various people. Oh, now the point I want to make, though, is that the wife who received this letter in 1865 she submitted this letter from him, another letter from him, and their marriage certificate. They had just been married in 1863. She submitted them as evidence in a claim for her husband's, who had been killed in the war, for a claim for her dead husband's back pay and enlistment bounty. And her letter sending these documents says, ask please that they be returned to her because they are all I have to remember him by. And there we found them still in the Army records, clearly not returned to her. Now, it's very exciting to find documentation like this, but you do feel, you do have a bit of a regret that the letters were not returned to her. Oh, and some of you may be interested to know that they had been married by Henry M. Turner, who was an AME minister. He's one of the handful of Black chaplains who served with Black regiments. But later in life, he became a very notable AME bishop of the AME Church. Another type of entirely personal correspondence that also fell into the bureaucratic net and thus were preserved alongside official records is correspondence between family members who'd been separated in slavery. And in fact, there's no more powerful indictment of the wrong of slavery than the incredible lengths to which ex-slaves went to locate long lost kin. All across the South, freed people set upon the task of reconstructing families that had been fragmented by sale, by inheritance, or by their owner's migration. This is a letter from a woman named Willie Ann Gray to her first husband, Philip Gray, in Virginia. She's in Kentucky. Many years before the war, her owner had moved her and their daughter to Kentucky, separating them, they thought, forever. After the war, Willie Ann Gray has tracked her down, Philip Gray has tracked them down, and she's now writing about the possibility of reuniting with him. She assures him that she loves him, but she has an important concern. And that is that she has 3 children that she'd had by her new husband in Kentucky. They're now fatherless because he had enlisted in the Union Army and be killed. But she's writing this letter to say, I want to rejoin you. I know I loved you then and I love you still, but she's concerned that he might not accept her children by the second husband. She writes, you must not think my family too large and get out of heart. For if you love me, you will love my children, and you will have to promise me that you will provide for them all as well as if they were your own. Evidently, Philip agreed to those terms because this letter is in the government records because he took it to the local bureau agent seeking government subsidized transportation to bring Willie Ann and the children from Kentucky to join him in Virginia. This is a similar letter, except it's about a cousin in Florida writing to a cousin, a man writing to his female cousin in Montgomery, Alabama, a single mother, she was a widow, who's having trouble supporting her 3 children in Montgomery. And he writes a letter saying, as inviting her and the children to come to Florida to live with him and his family. Come down and I will have a place for you and your 3 children. For I know that it is hard enough for a woman to get along that has a husband to help her. And one that has not, I do not know how they get a living these times. Stay here as long as you want to. If it's 3 or 4 years, it will not make a bit of difference. Please come down and make your home here with my family. Like Willie Ann Gray's letter, this one fell into the government network, the network of government records, because the cousin in Montgomery took it to the Freedmen's Bureau agents to prove that if the government would pay her transportation to Florida, she would be provided for and would be off the relief rolls in Montgomery. All right, I want to close with a truly remarkable set of letters. Because of the time, I'll read just one of them. But a really remarkable set of letters written by a Black soldier in Missouri. The images are too large for the slides, so I've given you transcriptions only. I think you will agree that the letters testify in equal measure to the intensity of family feeling among slaves and ex-slaves. And secondly, a keen awareness of the injustice of slavery. And third, to a new sense of confidence that at long last, history was on the side of the enslaved. Because this Black soldier is drawing strength from the Union's commitment to emancipation, and he's drawing on his own participation in the Army of Freedom. So these are letters by Private Spotswood Rice, first to his enslaved daughters who are still held in slavery, in which he assures them that their freedom's at hand. He says, "Don't be uneasy, my children. I expect to have you. If Diggs don't give you up, this government will, and I feel confident I will get you." But then I'll read in full. He wrote a second letter to Kitty Diggs, the owner who was still holding one of his daughters as a slave. And here's what he says. Oh, I do need to point out that in his letter to his daughters, he says that on the 28th of the month, 800 white and 800 Black soldiers are going to go up the river to Glasgow and above, that will be generaled by a general that will give me both of you. Now he writes to the mistress. I received a letter from Caroline telling me that you say I tried to steal, to plunder my child away from you. Now, I want you to understand that Mary is my child, and she's a God-given right of my own, and you may hold on to her as long as you can, but I want you to remember this one thing, that the longer you keep my child from me, the longer you will have to burn in hell, and the quicker you'll get there. For we are now making up about 1,000 Black troops. Notice it was 800 Black troops in the letter to the daughter. Now it's risen to 1,000. We are making up about 1,000 Black troops to come up through and want to come through Glasgow. And when we come, woe be to Copperhead rebels and to the slaveholding rebels, for we don't expect to leave them their root nor branch. But we think, however, that we that have children in the hands of you devils, we will try your virtues the day that we enter Glasgow. I want you to understand, Kitty Diggs, that wherever you and I meet, we are enemies to each other. I offered once to pay you $40 for my own child, but I'm glad now you did not accept it. Just hold on now as long as you can, and the worse it will be for you. Let me skip a bit. Now you call my children your property. Not so with me. My children is my own, and I expect to get them. And when I get ready to come after Mary, I will have brought a power and authority to bring her away and to execute vengeance on them that holds my child. You'll then know how to talk to me. I can assure that. And you'll know how to talk right, too. I want you now to just hold on to her if you want to. If your conscience tells you that's the road, go that road, and what it will bring you to, Kitty Diggs. I have no fears about getting Mary out of your hands. This whole government gives cheer to me, and you cannot help yourself. All right, I hope that gives you a good sense of some of the documents that are to be found. This last slide, there's our website again, if you want to read more documents. And here are our major publications. As Trudy said, 6 volumes so far of Freedom, A Documentary History of Emancipation. Another volume that's been held up because of the 2-year closure of the National Archives because of COVID, but it's almost finished, so it should be out next year. But then the next 4 volumes, Free at Last, Slaves No More, Families of Freedom, Freedom Soldiers, these are the ones we prepared for classroom use and for general readers. They're all available in paperback, and you might find them good places to start. You can get details about all of them on the website, including links to the publishers. Some of them, I'll also give you a hint, are available as inexpensive used copies on Amazon and other places. All right, thank you so much, and I would be delighted to take any questions if time permits.
Thank you so much, Leslie. It was a wonderful discussion with really extraordinary documents. You've got lots of questions in the chat.
Oh,
So let's take a few of them. And a couple of them are sort of similar, and they're about writing and how many of the letters actually were written by the formerly enslaved person, and how many were basically dictated.
yeah. Only a small minority of enslaved people were literate. Definitely fewer than 10%. Most historians estimate probably no more than 5%. But in addition, though, there were opportunities beginning during the war that there are a good many of ex-slaves who gained their first acquaintance with literacy during the war. Black soldiers in particular, in the Black regiments, they had schools, especially during the winter. The white officers were very interested in at least having the non-commissioned officers learn to read and write because of all the record keeping that needed to be done. So a good many slaves who were illiterate, entirely illiterate at the beginning of the war, acquired at least some rudimentary literacy. Some of those letters from Black soldiers are probably written by men who are pretty newly and barely literate. And then, of course, after the war, the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern Aid Societies established a great many schools across the South, and freed people flocked to those schools. So some of the letters that are written by ex-slaves are by people who've acquired that literacy only during and after the war. But one other thing we can tell is that many slaves who could not write got slaves who did have some literary skills to write, some literacy skills to write for them. That is, those ex-slaves who did have some literacy skills seem to have felt obligated to write for the others. But those documents are far, far outnumbered by the affidavits and testimony by people who clearly were entirely illiterate. But the Freedmen's Bureau, especially the Freedmen's Bureau courts and the Freedmen's Bureau complaint registers, gave them opportunities to come in and state their complaint. Now, how precisely and how accurately those Bureau agents recorded their words, we can't know. But they at least were trying to capture the gist of what they said. But it's very clear that the literate are a small minority.
Judy Berman, you ask a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, I was curious about the terminology, you know, and about the, you know, the language of talking about people as slaves or talking about people as formerly enslaved and kind of the agency that implies. And I'm wondering if the project has taken a position on that, you know, given that it's obviously drawing on, you know, historical record, which might vary from what we would use today.
Yeah. Well, this project began in the late 1970s, and the suggestion to use enslaved and enslaver is a very recent advent. So we began at a time, the documents of the time used slaves and ex-slaves or freed people. We did choose to use freed people rather than freed men, so that we can talk at times about freed men and then freed women. But what we've really found is just that you need to use both simply for variety when you're talking and writing. No, so I probably was shifting between the two, and that's more just you're right that if you say enslaved people rather than slaves, it makes it clearer that they were acted upon. They were enslaved by someone else, but it's often awkward to use the two words rather than the one. So I myself have adopted the strategy, and I do this in teaching too, of just using both. Sometimes when you want to particularly to be emphasizing agency, you would use that, but otherwise, I think it's right now historians are simply using both, with some more strongly committed than others to calling all slaveholders enslavers, not using slaveholders. Certainly at the time, the documents talk about slaveholders, masters, mistresses.
Thank you.
Karen Brannon asks, I understand that regular folks, many volunteers, are involved in transcribing these records for NARA's website. Is this correct? And if so, how much progress has been made?
I haven't kept up with it, but the project is being managed by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And their goal is to use crowdsourcing to transcribe as many of the Freedmen's Bureau documents as possible. Only the Freedmen's Bureau documents, not the other documents I was talking about. Our project uses about 24 different record groups, of which the Freedmen's Bureau records are only one. But they're interested in transcribing even those documents I dismissed as being more routine and bureaucratic, because many of them are interested in the documents for reasons of genealogical study. So even if it's just like all those huge contract files, those would be really valuable to genealogists. So they're setting out to transcribe all of the records. I think they've done a lot, but I don't have an update as to where things stand currently. But if you're at all interested in this, I do encourage you to go to the website of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. They would be delighted to find some new transcribers.
Someone else asks, do we know what happened as a result of specific complaints or requests? You showed a number of them, and sometimes you said we know and sometimes we don't.
Well, the answer is sometimes we know and sometimes we don't. We try, especially once we've decided to publish a document. Well, I should back up and say that to give you a sense of how selective our edition is, when we did our initial research of the National Archives, the first years, when we were just plowing through the documents, selecting out of them and photocopying the ones that seemed most useful for this documentary history. I say we because it was always 2 or 3, sometimes 4 editors, and then lots of graduate students, especially in the summer. So not an army, but a group. And in that time, we selected and photocopied 50,000 documents. And we have those photocopied 50,000 documents here in our offices. And out of that 50,000, we are selecting documents to publish in the volumes. When the whole edition of Freedom is finished, we will have published, somewhere around 5,000 documents. So that 50,000 that we selected initially, we estimated is only about 2% of the records we went through at the archives. And then out of that 50,000, we will publish only about 5,000. So each document that you see is just the tip of an iceberg. There could be many, many more. Now, we, of course, selected what we thought were the best documents, the most vivid, giving a special priority to the documents that have direct testimony by slaves and ex-slaves, either written by them or in the form of affidavits and testimony. But once we decide to publish a document, we move heaven and earth to try to find out the outcome of the case. That is, if it's a letter received in some office, we do follow-up research of the archives in the letter sent of that office to see if there was a reply. But often there's just no trail. You just don't know. But sometimes we do know, and in some of the cases that I knew, I told you about that. But there are many times that the trail just goes dead. you just don't have any further documentation.
Well, thank you, Leslie. We're running a little bit over time, but it was so fascinating. I'm sure there would be other questions if we could. I'm sure you will get some questions in your email from people who
Okay.
didn't have a chance to talk tonight. Let me remind everybody, however, that October 10, Monday, is Robert Krughoff talking about Washington Consumers Checkbook and 25 years of consumerism in Washington, D.C. And until that time, join me in doing this for Leslie.
Thank you.